Welcome to Conscious Revolution, a podcast about political awakening. My name is Margaret Daftian, and I'm here to help you navigate a confusing world of misinformation, hidden agendas, AI, and cult dynamics. Because it's not enough to just evolve, we must also resist and challenge those destructive influences that distort our evolution. Get in, loser! We're starting a conscious revolution. Hey, what's going on? This is Margaret. I am back from a very long break, and you may have noticed that there's been some rebranding here, rebranding the name of my brand, the name of this podcast, and my name, even though that's not really a rebrand. It's more like just using my actual name instead of my cult identity. So it's like a reverse rebrand or something super meta. Anyway, I'm happy to be back. And actually, I now have a podcast team to enhance your listening experience. And I'm really excited about that because I'm bringing on new guests and it's just going to level everything up. And B, I'm accountable to at least 2 podcast episodes per month now, where I'm going to alternate between a solo cast and a guest interview. So you can look forward to more consistency there. And because it's been a minute since I've reintroduced myself and my mission, what this space is all about, I just want to give a quick recap of what I talk about in this space for anyone who might be new, and a little bit of a refresher for my existing listeners. And actually, it will go into today's segue into what I want to talk about, which is Political Awakening 102. So I did a Political Awakening 101 last year, and I think it's a good time now to introduce level 2. So if you haven't listened to Political Awakening 101, I highly recommend that you do that and then come back, or you can just finish listening to this, but make sure you check out that first one. So political awakening is the part of our spiritual journey or our personal evolution, which has to do with a lot of the themes, right, that I talk about in my teaching. So on one hand, I raise awareness about cults and cult dynamics within the New Age industry, as well as the coaching industry, and just many other industries under late capitalism that are very culty and toxic. But obviously, New Age and coaching are the industries that I'm most familiar with. So that's why I talk about it the most. Not because I think that like they're the worst industries out there. Just it's the ones that I'm most familiar with and comfortable to talk about because I've had direct experience there. And then on the other side of that coin of cult dynamics is more solutions-oriented approach around social responsibility, what that means, corporate social responsibility, as well as like our own social responsibility when it comes to ethical living, conscious consumerism. And the reason why I raise awareness and education about these topics is because really I'm here to promote a democratic, just, fair, and equal society, which is why I get political, because politics is at the front and center of social change, and real social change does need to happen on a policy level. And that's why I take a stand for activism and allyship to socially marginalized communities, which, all of this sort of reflects where I'm at in my own personal evolution and in my own spiritual journey, which is political awakening. and the goal of this spiritual journey, because we all have different goals, right? And I'm not saying that mine is the right one or mine is the best one. It's just the one that feels most aligned with my values. And my spiritual goal is collective liberation, because my belief is that we are interconnected, and thus evolution, our evolution, human evolution, doesn't happen in a vacuum. So injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere, and political awakening is having an expanded self-awareness around how we are impacted by injustice, or maybe even contribute to systemic injustices. And it's not just systemic injustices, but it's our contribution to society, right? Is it meaningful? Is it sustainable? Is it authentic? Or is it motivated by narratives that we've accidentally internalized as truth, that are really just byproducts of a socio-political climate, which is going to change, right? So the idea is that the nature of reality doesn't change. And this is what I kind of go more into in that the first political awakening episode, is that the nature of reality doesn't change. And awakening, to me, my interpretation is that it says is getting as close to the nature of reality as possible. So, like, somebody asked me, and I'm gonna actually segue into this question, they asked me, what is the point of awakening? And for me, that is the point. It's very growth oriented, and the point is to get as close to the nature of reality as possible. But trends, social movements, these things are temporary, and thus they don't represent the nature of reality. And it's particularly relevant right now, more than ever in history, because we're living in the information age and the post-truth era. This era, I've talked about it in a newsletter, and I was talking about it quite a bit last year too, is the post-truth era, which it's really where we're at in our current zeitgeist. Post-truth is the international word of the year according to Oxford Dictionary in 2016, which coincidentally was the same year that Trump was elected. And this era is defined as the phenomena where personal feelings and beliefs are more influential in shaping public opinion than are objective facts, than is the actual nature of reality. And this era also coincides with the trend of anti-intellectualism, anti-science. So in the post-truth era, the truth really depends on who's speaking it, right? And those who are in the position of power and status and money are more influential in promoting whatever truth they want. And I believe that that's why society itself has become so culty, because there is that level of coercive control that is going on a mega corporate, mega political, mega religious level that is making it really, really hard to discern reality from illusion. And that's kind of the entire purpose of political awakening, is to see the forest from the trees, and see the forest for the trees, and zoom out enough to see how history and politics and economics and social sciences and all these different disciplines, how they sort of merge, right? And they infiltrate our institutions, our policies, our collective consciousness. And then we ask, where am I in all of this? Who am I in all of this? Without being thrown into some crazy existential crisis about it, but just to, just to know ourselves, really know ourselves and show up authentically, which is really what it's all about. And this is why my previous podcast was called Authentic Life. This is sort of what I was trying to get at, but then I think that phrase has been so co-opted by New Age, and it's just so buzzwordy that, I just kind of had to part ways with it, even though this is what authenticity means to me, is to discern reality from illusion and then see where we are in our own awareness, like self-awareness, but also social awareness, political awareness too, right? And I think this is what is missing actually from New Age spirituality and even to some extent psychology, like existential psychology, humanistic psychology. I think that where we're at right now is there's a lot of overemphasis on the self, which obviously, like, spirituality is very self-fulfilling in a sense that it is so deeply personal. But I guess the application of it, right? Like it's the part where we have to integrate ourselves into these social systems that govern our lives. And I think that hyper focusing on the self, which is really just like a reflection of our hyper individualistic society, I think it serves us to like a certain point, but at another point it becomes excessive. And it becomes like an excessive way of self-referencing and self-idolatry that actually disconnects us from the truth of the whole. And not only does that hurt us, in terms of our growth and our evolution, but it just doesn't integrate well in society to allow us to sort of participate in society as well-adjusted and informed and aware citizens, right? So my work with people on this path of political awakening really has to do with like crystallizing yourself within, being so super crystallized as an individual that you don't get lost in these trends and these movements, and then accidentally you're manifesting somebody else's life or internalizing someone else's truth as your own. So if it's very like self-focused still, but it's also integrating the self with society, that's like the gist of political awakening. And I did not coin that term. I don't know where I first heard it. I'm sorry. I'll try to research and then I'll put it in this show notes. It's definitely not an original term. But when I heard it, I was like, wow, it's something about it really resonated with where I was at in my own journey of sort of like figuring out like, whoa, waking up from like all that New Age delusion and just being like, whoa, where have I been the last few years? So that's sort of why like I've been taking these big hiatuses as well, which is not great for for like building a brand and a business. But honestly, like there was so much, like I started my business as like a new age sort of brand. And so obviously there's been such a big personal process of me disentangling from all of that. And, some of it has occurred online in my content and sharing with people. And then other parts of it have been very private and just my own sort of reflection and my own incubation period and my own integration period with all of it. And, it's also part of like the deprogramming work. So I do want to like actually talk about these breaks that I've taken, and these like really long, like 4 or 6 month breaks. But I will talk about that in the future, because I think it really, there's so much insight there that I have yet to share. It's just, I'm one person. I can't talk about all of the things, but there's definitely a lot there that I think would be really helpful for anyone who might be going through that same sort of deconstructing, deprogramming process. And for me, this last break it was really where I was able to untangle myself from all the cult stuff and the cult identity, right? And birth a new mission and birth a new purpose for my brand, but also just for myself. And, just kind of evolving out of new age spirituality and just kind of positioning my brand not within that at all, because I find that industry just so toxic and harmful and performative. It's really performative spirituality, and I'm hesitant to like criticize anyone's brand of spirituality because I think it's so personal, and new age spirituality can certainly serve a purpose at some point in our journey. It certainly did for me, right? It's like an access point to deeper spiritual truths, but we have to evolve out of it. We have to, because if we think that it's the end all be all of spirituality, we're fucked. We are fucked. Because those teachings like law of attraction, manifestation, I mean, they're born out of scams, like just these scammy, conspiratorial sort of, anyway, I think it's important to educate about the socio-political history of New Age, which I plan to do more and more. It was because of my self-education, right, that I was able to break free from the constraints of that industry over my own like spiritual awakening process. And that has been like integral to my political awakening. So right before my big break, I mentioned it just earlier, like somebody had asked me, what is the point of awakening? I tried to address it in my newsletter on Substack, because this question, like, it came to me at a very interesting point when I was like so deep in my deprogramming work and untangling myself, evolving out of New Age. So it was interesting to receive this question, and I tried to answer it in the newsletter, but it felt incomplete, and it begged for a part 2, which I wanted to do. And actually I wrote the outline for this podcast back then. It was like over 6 months ago at this point. And then I just kind of didn't get around to it. But I did create the outline. And at the time, I used Eckhart Tolle's teachings about awakening because I thought that it would be a great way to answer this question through deconstructing Eckhart Tolle's ideas, because he's sort of like the authority, the cultural authority on awakening. So I think a lot of people who follow his teachings and digest his teachings without much critical thought, and I can tell you that from my experience, again, it served me until it didn't. And I hope you can understand by the end of this episode how this is related to political awakening, because it's when you start to ask like really, really important questions around, okay, I learned these teachings and they're super inspiring and they seem to be helping me and serving me, but is it still serving me a year later, 2 years later, 4 or 5 years later, right? Are these teachings translating across the complexities of my life and the complexities of our society? Are they helping me solve problems? Are they true? And so you start to reality test them, and it can be a really, really hard place to be, because when you find a teaching that you think like, yes, this is it. This is going to work. I found it. I found the key. I found the secret magic thing that is just going to, unlock all of these mysteries of the universe and the mysteries of my being. And it's just going to solve my perpetual existential crisis. Like, I went through so much of that. And interestingly enough, my last podcast that's titled A Political Awakening, Who Is In, right? Who Is In was my practice and my tool and my key at the time. And I thought that it was it. And it's still very useful. I'm not going to say that it's not useful. It is, but it stopped working for me in certain contexts at a certain point. And I had to allow myself to evolve out of it, which is really, really, really hard and scary because I relied so much on it to guide me. And without that, it was like I had to figure it out on my own and make it through the confusion on my own. And I know that a lot of spiritual seekers go through this, like, divorcing from a spiritual teaching or a doctrine or a teaching or a teacher, or a belief system. Oh, it's so hard. And it's so scary. Like, if you're going through that right now, I just want to pause here and say, I see you, hang in there. And I hope that you will find your way. Just stay grounded and don't get lost. Don't get lost in the sauce. I have so much compassion for people who are feeling as lost as I was. I'm getting a little choked up talking about it because coming out of that, being on the other side of that, there really was a point where I didn't think that I was going to be on the other side of it. And I wanted to give up. Not give up on my life, obviously. Well, not so obviously. There were some pretty dark moments there, but just the feeling of being really, really hopeless and helpless and depressed, in this existential way, just being in so much existential pain, it does something to a person's morale and their sense of self. So I don't know who needs to hear this, but you're not alone, and you're gonna get through it. You're gonna make it. So just hang in there. I see you. Okay, so I wanted to introduce this part 2 of my talk on political awakening by deconstructing Eckhart Tolle's 3 major teachings. He has these 3 teachings that I want to focus on. Obviously, first he has way more than 3 teachings, but these particular 3 really capture the essence of political awakening. And, they demonstrate where New Age spirituality misses the mark on having a more grounded approach to the awakening process, which is how and why these teachings get pretty culty, right? So if you don't know Eckhart Tolle, you're not familiar with him, he is considered a spiritual thought leader of, I don't know, the century or something. He's a big time spiritual influencer of our time. He's written a number of books. 2 of them are bestsellers, The Power of Now and New Earth. And I think depending on where you're at in your spiritual journey, you're probably going to have a different way of relating to his work. And I personally don't think that he has added anything new to the spiritual marketplace, so to speak, because a lot of his work is inspired by Buddhism and Taoism and Christianity. He just has a unique way of presenting ideas and the language that he uses to conceptualize some of these more complex and mystical ideas. And he does it in a way that seems to resonate with a lot of people, especially people who are perhaps new to spirituality or meditation. And so I think it can serve as a good introduction. And a big part of my work here is in critiquing New Age spirituality, kind of like pop spirituality, right? Spirituality that distorts or misrepresents ancient wisdoms and teachings. And I'm not going to say that Eckhart Tolle directly misrepresents these teachings, but I do consider him to be in the category of New Age spiritual teachers, even though his teachings do go beyond just like the typical manifestation, law of attraction stuff. He's still in the genre of New Age for me. And I just find it really fascinating that people don't see that, because again, it's like not being able to see the forest for the trees. So I will give a little bit of context in just a moment about what I mean by New Age spirituality, but Eckhart Tolle it's really interesting to critique him and his work, because every time I do, there's always disagreements. Some people are really, really big fans, and I get it. I do. There was a point in time that I thought his teachings were very helpful, but I don't really buy into the hype. I just don't. And in this episode, I hope that I will do a good job of communicating why. Okay, so a really brief overview to set some context about what I mean by New Age, and yeah, how I sort of define it, and then I'm gonna go into whether or not there's this disagreement about whether or not Eckhart Tolle is New Age, and if he's New Age, is he culty? Because New Age is culty. So I'm gonna talk about all of that. So first, what do we mean by New Age? Well, New Age is actually not very new, right? It's part of the evolution of the New Thought movement, which started in the early 19th century and even earlier, actually. So what we call New Age has like 100-year sociocultural and sociopolitical history. And it just represents Western occultism, which is the category of spirituality and spiritual beliefs and practices that originated in the East, but then were brought over from the East to the West by various spiritual philosophers and teachers and mystics who happen to be predominantly white men. Carl Jung, for example, is one of them. So I use New Age in a more like technical way to describe the entirety of this socio-cultural movement that we're living in right now. And like I said, like when we lose sight, when we can't see the forest for the trees, we lose sight of where we're at in terms of like those era-defining movements. And we tend to become myopic and just don't zoom out far enough to see the era that we are living in, or to see ourselves, because humans are very myopic, and we tend to see ourselves as separate from the trees, so to speak, right? When we think that we're living or operating outside of these movements, or we're not personally influenced by these movements, we're seeing ourselves as separate from the whole forest. I don't know if I said trees or forest before, but anyway, we're seeing ourselves as outside of the forest, right? And the whole point of political awakening is to bring that kind of expanded awareness of our experience of reality as being part of the forest, meaning where it's part of the greater context of our social and political and cultural evolution. And I think it's a big misconception to see any kind of like westernized form of spirituality as outside of the New Age movement, because that is the movement of our time. That is the forest, that we're swimming in those waters, right? I mean, even me just sitting here and creating content or consuming content about spirituality is very much a product of how spirituality has been captured, commodified, materialized in the New Age movement. And it's not like good or bad, it just is, right? This is just our reality. It's just reality as it is. And just recognizing that we're all very much a part of this New Age movement, myself included. And just because we critique a movement for its harmful or toxic aspects doesn't mean that we see ourselves as separate from it or above it or beyond it. It's just more about, well, how can we practice this in an ethical way, in an authentic way? And we really can't do that if we think that we're separate from it, right? It's in fact when we see ourselves as a part of it, not apart from it, that we care enough to want to make it better, and to minimize the harm and improve the standards of how something is practiced. And that's where social responsibility and ethics comes in. Otherwise, like, why would you care, right? If it wasn't relevant to you, why would you even bother? And so that's why when I speak out against New Age, like, some people misunderstand this to mean that I am anti-New Age, and how can I be anti something that I'm a part of? So when I talk about New Age or refer to something as New Age, I'm not using it as like a derogatory way. I'm not disparaging it. I'm just using it in a very technical way to describe the dominant spiritual movement of our time. That's it. So please don't misunderstand me. And even though I've evolved myself out of like some of those bullshit norms and practices, and I do see myself as like just evolved out of that. But my brand, I mean, I talk about spirituality, and my brand is very much a part of this movement. And this is why I care enough. This is why I care so much to want to make it better, to want to make it more ethical, more trauma mindful, and a safer experience. So when I critique teachers like Eckhart Tolle, which I'm about to do, I'm not singling them out because I think that they're bad teachers or their teachings are like trash, should be tossed in the bin immediately. No, I'm really critiquing the larger sociocultural movement that has contributed to so much chaos and confusion that we're seeing in our collective. Then and only then can we ask, what is my role in all of this? How am I contributing to it? How am I perpetuating it? How am I influenced by it? Where am I in all of this? That's political awakening. So is Eckhart Tolle New Age? Yes. I believe he is. Is he a cult leader? Okay, I'm going to say no on this one. And I'll go a little bit more into it in my critique. And he is also a part of the New Age movement, which is inherently founded on some pretty culty ideologies. And what's been disappointing to me about Tolle is that being as influential as he is, he hasn't really dismantled these more toxic ideologies. I had never heard him talk about the cult of New Age and how his teachings and his ideas have gotten grossly distorted by fake gurus and leaders until I heard his interview on a Little Bit Culty podcast, which I really enjoyed listening to. I think that the hosts, Sarah and Nippy, who are survivors of the NXIVM cult, and they host a podcast where they bring on different cult survivors and teachers, and they brought Eckhart Tolle on. I think they did a really great job interviewing him about toxic spirituality and spiritual cults. And it was super interesting because some people, myself included, think of Eckhart Tolle as somewhat of a cult leader. So it was strange to see him being like revered on an anti-cult podcast. But I will say that after listening to his interview with Sarah and Nippy, I am walking myself back from my initial opinion of him as a cult leader and taking like a more nuanced approach in my critique of his brand of teachings. Again, like as they kind of sit within this larger sociocultural context of the New Age movement. So with that said, let's get into some of my critiques here. I have 3 main critiques. Number 1, Eckhart Tolle says that spiritual awakening is the end-all be-all of human potential. This is his belief. According to Tolle, spiritual awakening is simply being present to what is, because when you're present, you are disidentified with the mind. And when you are disidentified with the mind, you can fulfill the potential of your consciousness, which is more expansive than just what our limited minds and the thoughts that accompany them are capable of. So he's really talking about transcending the ego. And depending on where you're at in your journey, this is either going to sound familiar and you're going to be like, oh, yes, you're going to grasp it, or it's just not going to land. And just because you don't understand something doesn't like automatically make it a word salad either. You know, some people on the podcast were critiquing it for being like super word salady, and I don't think that it was word salad. I think that he does use a lot of buzzwords, but word salad, from my understanding, is that when people use buzzwords in a way that's meant to confuse or manipulate you to get you to do something. So word salad is more like a gaslighting and manipulation tactic versus just using a bunch of buzzwords. I think it's just important to like make that small distinguishing element of it, because if we go around calling every spiritual phrase or idea word salad, it's kind of going to lose its meaning. So while I agree with the definition of awakening as a disidentification with the mind or the ego, I am highly skeptical of the notion that it's the end-all be-all of human potential. I don't know what the end-all be-all of human potential is, because unlike Tolle, I don't think that there is a higher purpose to life that we should all be striving for. I tend to hold the perspective that purpose is a very personal thing, and we create our meaning or purpose for ourselves. So I generally don't agree with any notion of purpose as some kind of like standard of living or being, because it's such a personal thing. Like, who gets to set that standard, right? Like, saying that spiritual awakening is fulfilling a higher purpose or your human potential also seems to suggest, if we really critically think deeply about it, it suggests that people who don't awaken or learn this skill of disidentifying with the mind, which is a skill, right? It's not like some inherent gift. Like, disidentifying with the mind is a skill. It's a self-mastery kind of skill, and it's actually a pretty advanced one. And to suggest that people who don't practice this or have this are not going to be able to the implication is that they're not going to be able to create meaning or purpose in their life, which I simply think is just not true, because people can find purpose in anything, and not everyone is going to dedicate time, attention, energy, money, resources to their spiritual path. I think everybody is on a spiritual path. We all are trying to we're seeking something, but you know, we're going to have different levels of commitment to our spiritual growth. And some people just simply don't even have time for it because they're like literally just trying to survive. And to suggest that those people are somehow not going to live or fulfill their potential, I think is like something about that just doesn't sit right with me. It comes off very like elitist and privileged, right? So I'll bring you this example. When I heard this podcast episode, I was in Armenia, which is sort of like where my big breakthrough happened with untangling from my like cult identity, because Armenia is my home country. So I went back to my roots, and it was like this big journey. So I was talking to my cousins, and they were expressing to me about their great aunt who just loved to do chores around the house. Like, she dedicated her entire life to doing chores. She had a number of children. I don't know how many children, but every single day she would wake up at like 5, and from like 5 a.m. to I don't know what, until she went to sleep, she was busy with all the house stuff, cooking, cleaning, this, that, right? Tending to being a homemaker. Her life purpose was being a homemaker, and she loved it. And she talked about it in this way of like, she's living her purpose and this is what she's meant to do, and she loves it. And somebody like me can look at that, because I have a very different purpose in life. Chores is not at all in the trajectory. God, I hate doing chores. But I could look at that and be like, oh wow, like how limited, right? How limited. This person's never gonna like be able to travel and experience the world. They're never gonna be disidentified with their role as like a caretaker or a homemaker. Man, that's so limiting. That's so this, that's so that. And those are all judgments. Those are all judgments towards somebody who is actually pretty free to be able to choose what purpose is for them, which is actually the entire purpose of having a purpose, is to be able to have that inner freedom to choose for yourself what is meaningful for your life and for your purpose. So for some people, it might be spiritual awakening. For others, it might be doing house chores all day. So I don't think like defining spiritual awakening as the end all be all of is it's not the end all be all of anything. It's just an experience. It's just a goal or an outcome. Actually, it's not even a goal or an outcome, because as soon as you make spirituality a goal or an outcome, then you're already operating through the mind, right? So you're not transcending the ego. So it's kind of like self-defeating in a way to this idea of purpose. So that's my critique around that. Number 2, he says, relatedly, that suffering has a higher purpose. And this one just really grinds my gears because, again, it's related to the first critique about spiritual awakening as this fulfillment of your higher potential. But this notion that suffering has a higher purpose, again, in my opinion, is extremely flawed and incomplete, because we cannot define anyone's purpose for them, which means that if someone wants to find a higher meaning in their suffering and that helps them, it's great. But this is not a hard and fast rule. And I just don't think that it's very trauma mindful to impose it as a truth with a capital T. This narrative that suffering has a higher meaning. Like, that sounds more like a personal belief, which is fine. But to position it as a capital T truth, I think makes it way, way too easy for people to gaslight others or victim blame about their trauma, or even deflect their own trauma, right? Which tends to be such a pervasive thing in our culture right now, because we're not trauma mindful as a collective. And I think this narrative just does not do our lack of trauma sensitivity and actual like victimization that goes on. I don't think it does it any justice. And if you're following me, you know that I'm a big believer of like ethical spirituality, which is just being trauma mindful, right? It's just being aware that capital T truths just don't really apply to everyone across all contexts. And so for a spiritual teacher of his caliber to repeat this narrative that suffering serves a higher purpose and then frame it as a truth, which like it's not a capital T truth, it's a personal belief, I think it's dangerous. And again, it just makes it way too easy to gaslight people and ourselves. And like, after listening to Tolle on this interview, I don't think that he would excuse abuse as like serving a higher purpose or dismiss things like war and genocide. I feel like he himself just got this sense that he's a lot more grounded than that. But I just don't appreciate how this idea that all of things, including our suffering, have a higher purpose, and how it's just framed as this like truth. I just think that's bullshit, personally. And again, this is my personal belief, right? And at the end of the day, who knows? Who knows what the capital T truth is? Like, if there is a purpose or there is not a purpose, I don't know. And I think that's the point. I think the point is to humble ourselves and ground ourselves enough to realize that in a reality with infinite possibilities, literally infinite possibilities, how can we possibly know which is the ultimate one? How can we possibly know which is the ultimate purpose? Like, we can give meaning or not give meaning, and things will be as they are, which really, like, when, the teaching on emptiness, for example, right? This is how I interpret the teaching on emptiness. And Eckhart Tolle talks about emptiness, but I think it's hypocritical for him to suggest that things have this inherent meaning or they serve a higher purpose, but at the same time, like, speak to the teaching on emptiness, which again, maybe my interpretation is different, but you know, it's emptiness means that events don't have inherent meaning because we live in this reality with infinite possibilities, right? If everything has meaning or purpose, then nothing has meaning or purpose. You know what I mean? So it's a paradox. So when I see a teacher or let's be honest, a rich and famous person talk about purpose and living their purpose, I can't help but be like, would this person still be just as successful living their purpose if their entire career wasn't built on teaching how others should live their purpose? And you got to ask that question, right? Because at the end of the day, everything is just an interpretation. And we all have a biased perspective about reality. And I typically don't trust the perspective of someone who is a celebrity or rich and famous because their interpretation of reality is not representative and generalizable to how most people live. And this is what we talk about when we say it's coming from an extreme place of privilege. Which brings me to my third critique, which has to do with spiritual cult abuse. Man, I was particularly fired up about this. I was like gonna send Sarah and Nippy this angry letter. And then I was like, okay, whatever. It is what it is. But oh gosh, even when I like say it, even when I say the words, it just grinds my gears, man. It's so wrong. Okay, he says that presence gives us immunity from cult control. Presence gives us immunity from cult control. As a spiritual cult survivor, this is a hell to the no. Like, absolutely not. And it was actually very triggering for me to hear this. And I felt very disappointed that neither Sarah nor Nippy challenged him on it. Like, I get it, it's Eckhart Tolle, but guys, like, y'all are cult abuse survivors. And you know that being present does not give you immunity from cult control. In fact, it makes us even more susceptible to spiritual cult abuse because the state of presence inherently requires that our critical thinking faculties are shut off. And that's how abuse happens. It's like, it was so disappointing for me to hear this because generally I think it's just bothersome how little importance critical thinking is given in spiritual communities because it's all about transcending the mind and the ego and not letting your limited mind like infringe on your experience of reality. I get it, but I would also love to see a teacher like Eckhart Tolle talk about it as it relates to cult control because at the end of the day, his teachings on presence have been so misquoted, so misused, and it's not his fault, but they are his teachings, and all he really has to do is just pay more attention to the awareness around critical thinking and the importance of discernment when interpreting these teachings. And he himself had even acknowledged, like on this podcast, how much his teachings are used for manipulation and control, and they all laughed about it like, haha, okay, is that actually funny though? Like, and then the solution that you offer is just be present. It's just disappointing that he doesn't seem to bear any responsibility to how his teachings have been misused. Like, he's obviously aware of it, and then he's sitting there talking to two cult abuse survivors who are coming out of one of the most abusive mainstream cults where, you know, the leader is now in jail. So this is beyond a personal problem, you know, it's a social problem. Like, cult control is a social problem. It's a public health hazard. And the failure or the reluctance to see yourself as part of that problem and not have the impetus to try to mitigate it or attempt to resolve it in any small capacity, like, I just will never understand that. And as an activist and I'm not saying that everybody has to advocate for cult abuse survivors, but you are on a cult abuse survivor platform giving an interview with cult abuse survivors to an audience composed of largely cult abuse survivors. Wouldn't you want to give some other advice other than like, just be present? It just goes to show that like either he just knows very little about cults, or he just doesn't care that much about it. It's like, just, can you read the room? So as a cult abuse survivor, personally, I was very triggered by this. I think it was the worst fucking advice ever. Presence is absolutely not going to magically give you immunity from cult control, Mr. Tolle. No. Nuh-uh. Critical thinking is. Discernment is. A healthy, strong ego is. Anyway, I think it's interesting how he says somewhere that something that is good in moderation can also be excessive and bad. And I just wonder if he thinks this about his own teachings, because his own teachings have been taken to an extreme. And if someone like Eckhart Tolle was interested in ethics, and ethics was something that he would be open to incorporating into his teachings and something that he valued, then he would share some of the responsibility of just how much New Age, including his own teachings, have been misrepresented and used for pretty violent and destructive behavior. Like, I would assume that you wouldn't just throw your hands up and be like, well, that was the path because, suffering was a lesson for you, or you're fulfilling your higher purpose, right? Like, not everyone is going to come out of that experience like Sarah, Nippy, or even me, right? We came out of that experience relatively unscathed. We're doing like pretty okay, it seems. And we're resilient. We're resilient enough to be able to talk about it publicly, which means we've processed some of it. But some people get really hurt and they don't bounce back. People enter into abusive relationships. They suffer financial trauma and like hardship. They go bankrupt. They get estranged from their families. Some people experience psychosis, depression, suicide. I mean, like, I'm not saying any of this is Eckhart Tolle's fault, obviously, but he is at the forefront of this movement, whether willingly or not. And I mean, it is his teachings that are being misused. So I just think that there has to be some level of accountability there. I think it's not so controversial to ask him to like clear things up a bit and clear up some of the confusion, or just take a more proactive role on his, like at least on his Instagram page, which is just like gold mine for spiritual bypassers and spiritual narcissists to get validation for their like delusional thinking. So anyway, there were more things that he said that gave me pause. And I may do a corresponding newsletter on my Substack about this topic and about this, deconstructing this particular episode. Like, it's been over 6 months, so I'll probably go listen to it one more time, even though I already listened to it twice. But I could go on, I could keep rambling, but I won't. I'm just gonna leave you with these 3 points to think about, and just sit on this idea that, is spiritual awakening a natural evolution of human consciousness? And is it really our greater purpose to become a conscious being? Or is there some grain of truth to that is getting distorted and not integrating very well with society? So I may explore that next in my Substack or in a subsequent podcast. So if you're not subscribed to my Substack, definitely do so. All right. Well, I think I'm ready to wrap up. I feel complete with that for today. Hope you enjoyed it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on if you did listen to this interview on Little Bit Culty with Eckhart Tolle. I think it's a 2-part interview. If you have thoughts or reflections about it, I would love to hear it. I also want to let you know that I am launching my website this month and opening up one-on-one mentorship or consulting. The mentorship is personal and professional mentorship. consulting is ethical business consulting, and I have different offerings at different price points. And I'm actually still running a pricing survey on that as part of my market research study to make my services affordable and accessible to people who want to work with me. So if that's you and you want to have a say in how I price my mentorship and my consulting, I invite you to fill out the survey. It's only like 4 minutes, super short, and it's a good way for us to establish a price point that is fair to the both of us. Everything I do in this space is for my audience. I'm community focused, so I'm always thinking of ways that I can really serve and provide value, and that's why I decided to do a market research survey to just get a sense of where people are at. So I would really appreciate if you participate in that. And also filling out this survey will put you on my wait list, which is actually filling up. I can only take a handful of people to start while, I still incorporate this part of my work into my business model and then continue creating all the content. So I can really only take a very small handful of people. So if you want to work with me, definitely let me know so that I can put you on the wait list. The waitlist is not a commitment. It's just a way to secure your place sooner rather than later. Okay, otherwise, thank you. I also have an ebook coming out. Look out for that. Lots of exciting things on the way. I have a guest interview for this podcast next time that I think you're really, really going to like. And I will catch you next time. Thanks so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please make sure you're subscribed to this podcast, and if you share it on social media, don't forget to tag me at Seek with Sarah. For my ebooks, courses, or to work with me one-on-one, visit my website, seekwithsarah.com. I appreciate you hanging out with me. Thanks for pressing play. See you next time.